What's up guys, Asian here again with another theory crafting video, and today we're going to be going over Magicka Regen glyph versus cost reduction glyph on an infused jewelry piece for healers. So I previously did a video looking at regen glyphs versus cost reduction glyphs on healers, and we pretty much came to the conclusion that regen glyphs are generally going to be a little bit more useful for healers for a variety of reasons, mainly the fact that they're affected by percentage boosts like CP and skills and buffs. So we're redoing this, we're re-examining this from the perspective of we have infused on all of our jewelry pieces. So with the introduction of Somerset, they introduced jewelry crafting, which also introduced a couple of new jewelry traits that you can run, and one of them is going to be called infused. So infused boosts our jewelry enchant by 60%, up to 60%. If it's completely golded out, then it's 60. And it's a little bit lower for each decreasing tier of jewelry. And you can see here that it does end up boosting our cost reduction glyph as well as our regen glyph. So you can see here, normally our cost reduction glyph is 203, but with infused, it bumps it up to 324. And with our regen glyph here, it's normally going to be 169, but when we have it infused, it ends up being 270. So naturally, we have to ask the question, does that actually affect the ultimate math? So the previous video that I did, it's still valid. The math there is still valid because arcane jewelry is still an option to run on healers. So it's really just going to be focusing in on how does infused affect the math at all? Does it affect the math at all? So much like the previous video where we took a look at regen versus cost reduction, we're basically going to be turning to our old friend, the UASP build editor here. If we go ahead and take a look at our build editor here, so I am on my healer build, so this is a Olorime plus worm build here, and we do have infused with a bunch of different things, mostly spell damage and then one Magicka Regen glyph. So here's where our Magicka Regen is sitting. So if we take a look here at the complete formula for Magicka Regen, this is what it all looks like. Again, this looks very complicated, but when you break it down into components part, it's actually quite simple. So you can basically break it down to there is a base amount of regen, and then there's the percentage modifiers to that base amount. So this entire value here is what's considered your base amount of regen. So this, for example, is just the regen that you get for whatever level you're at. And then you have item Magicka Regens. This comes from your jewelry glyphs, so your regen glyphs. Set Magicka Regen. This comes from your set bonuses, so that's the 129 Magicka Regen that you get for a set bonus. Your Mundus Magicka Regen, if you're running the Atronach, then this is where this gets added in. And then you have your food Magicka Regen as well. And food Magicka Regen is obviously from whatever food you have, Witch Mothers, Red Frothgar, things like that. Now food is uniquely buffed by what's called a skill 2 Magicka Regen, and I'm not 100% certain what falls under here. There's actually very, very few things that fall under skill 2 from what I can recall. So I don't remember it off the top of my head, so I don't really have to worry about skill 2 Magicka Regen all too much. So this entire value here is what's called the base amount of regen, and the reason why we call it the base amount is because this is affected by the following multipliers. So this is what our percentage multipliers come in. So we have our CP Magicka Regen. This just comes from Arcanus, so either 0 to 0.15. Our skills, which come from any of our passive skills. So right now you can see we have 30% here in our skills, which would translate to 0.3. And so this comes from all of our different skill passives. So not only does it count things like class passives, so for example, Sorks and I believe Nightblades have additional class passives that boost their Magicka Regen, so those are added in there. Templars unfortunately do not have that. All classes have access to the evocation, which gives us 4% for every piece of light armor we have. If you're a vampire, then you have access to supernatural recovery, which gives us another 10%. And then everybody has access to Magicka Aid under the support line, which increases by 10% for each support ability you have slotted. So all that is what's called the skill Magicka Regen. Then you have your buff Magicka Regen. This comes from major and minor intellect. So as you can see here, adding on that additional item here is going to make actually a fairly significant difference. That's because that 270 is not a flat 270 that's added on. It is 270 added onto your base, which is then affected by your percentage multipliers. So that 270 is actually going to end up being a lot more than what you see on the glyph itself. Now what about cost reduction? So cost reduction, if we go ahead and go down here, let's see, where is it? So cost reduction on the other hand is flat. Here it is. So here's our cost reduction formula. You just have your spell cost and then you multiply it by your CP. This is an old formula. This is back before Homestead, before Morrowind, when there was a CP that actually reduced the cost of your magic abilities. So this is pretty much defunct now. And then you have this plus your item magic cost. So this is actually would be a negative number here. So if we had our spell cost reduction glyph here, it would be minus 203 or minus 324. And then it's multiplied by your skill magicka cost, plus your set magicka cost, plus your buff magicka cost, plus 1. So these are basically all your percentage multipliers again. So skill magicka costs, this is basically any sort of skills that decrease the cost of your magic abilities. So you see here we have 9 to 17%. This comes from a few passives here. So let me see if I can find it. So first one's going to be from Restoring Spirit. So this reduces our cost by 4% for just only Templars. And then the light armor line, I believe, has, does it still have it? Yeah, so light armor also has 10% cost reduction to your magic abilities here by 10%. And then the last 3% comes from, actually, I don't know where it comes from. We have 14%. I'm trying to figure out what skill would actually give us an additional cost reduction. But that's basically what your skill cost reductions are. So it's basically things that are basically skills that reduce the cost of your abilities. There's not that many out there. The big one's going to be that light armor passive there, which is about 10%. And you have set magic cost. This would be things like Worm. So Worm would be included here. It's a 4% reduction. And then buff magic cost. So this is things that reduce the cost of your next magic ability. Again, not that many out there. I can't think of any off the top of my head, really. So you can see here that there's far fewer percentage multipliers here compared to our Magicka Regen. So the Magicka Regen has a lot more skills that increase our regen versus skills that reduce the cost. And that's kind of built into the game that way. So your regen is going to be a little bit more important than your cost is right off the bat. So if we take a look at this right now and just basically compare two things. So if we decide to take out our Magicka Regen here, you just put it to 0, it'll automatically update it, so we're sitting at 2016. So if we add in our infused Magicka Regen glyph here, our 2016 jumps up to 2404. So I'm just going to write it down here. So we had 2404 minus 2016, which gives us an increase of 388. Let's just double check our numbers here. 2016, 2404. So Magicka Regen, again, is every 2 seconds. So every 2 seconds, we're getting that additional 388 from that one infused Magicka Regen glyph. Now let's go ahead and take a look at our cost reduction. So if we take a look at our cost reduction here, we're going to be on our Templar here. And let's say we have an infused, that's going to be minus 324. So we have our base cost is 3,000. This is just going to be like a flat amount here. It's obviously going to be increased a little bit more depending on your specific skill cost, but 3,000 is a pretty nice place to sit at. So we're starting off at 2490, and if we take away our 324, we have 2221. So 2490 minus 2221, and it gives us 269. So that's the actual amount of cost reduction we're getting. Notice that it's lower just because of where it is placed in the whole thing. So our item cost reduction, if we go back to our build editor here, is reduced from the initial cost rather than reduced from the final adjusted cost. So this basically means we're getting a little bit less out of our cost reduction glyph as we should. So that's reflected in our equation here, where we're getting 269 compared to 324. So now if we double this, because let's assume that we're basically casting our abilities, let's say we're casting them not perfectly, so the global cooldown is 1 ability every second. We're obviously not going to be able to do that perfectly. We're going to be heavy attacking to maybe have infallible aether uptime and things like that. So let's say you're able to cast an ability, let's say once every 1 1/3 second to 1 1/2 second. Let's go with 1 1/3 to be a little bit generous here. So 1 ability every 1.3 seconds is that, or so that's basically how many abilities you have per second here. So you're basically casting 0.769 abilities per second. So then we have to take this and actually multiply this by 269 times 269. So that'll give us an actual base cost here. So if we do this divided by 1.3, we'll see that it's actually going to be closer to 207. And then if we basically multiply this by 2, it's to reflect regen, because again, regen is every 2 seconds in combat, so this is every second, so this is value is every second, so Magicka reduction cost per second. So we need to just multiply this value by 2, and we get 413.8. So right off the bat, you can see that cost reduction is going to be a little bit stronger in this specific scenario. So this is before we consider things like major intellect and minor intellect. So what happens when we do add in things like major intellect? And let's say we also add in worm as well here. We're running worm. So if we are sitting at, right now we're sitting at 30%. So we're adding in buffs. So let's say we have major intellect from potions as well as minor intellect. So that gives us additional 30%. So 2905, going back here. So we have 2905, take away 2016, which was our base before we added in that infused thing. So we have 8890. And then if we take a look, go back here, oops, go back here to our cost reduction. So we take away our 324, and then we add in worm, which is a minus 4%, so 2114. So take a look here, so 2490 minus 2114, so 376. Just double check real quick, yeah, 2776. And so again, we have to go the same thing, so we have to do 376 times our assumption, which is 1 ability every 1.3 seconds, times that by number of seconds we have, and so we have 578. Basically, regen, you can think of it every 2 seconds, compared to 889 regen per second. So you can see here, just by the inclusion of major and minor intellect, which is not that hard to get actually, you can see that our cost reduction glyph loses out by a very significant amount, by about 300 every 2 seconds, and that's going to be that's a pretty high amount. So what happens if we're actually able, ideal scenario, we're able to cast an ability every second? Well, in that case, we just take our, we take our 376 and we just multiply it straight by 2, and a 752, which still loses out to the amount of regen that we got from our Magicka Regen glyph. So even under ideal scenario, Magicka Regen glyph still wins out, and that's basically the scenario that we came up with without infused. So the addition of infused didn't really actually change our end result, which is that there's really never a reason to run cost reduction as a healer or as a DPS, or really at all, even as a tank. Basically, the cost reduction doesn't hold a candle at all to Magicka Regen glyphs, to the very least for healers, probably for DPS as well, Magicka DPS, if you for whatever reason want to run a cost reduction versus regen glyph or something like that. So definitely, this is why basically all healers recommend running regen over cost reduction, because you get a lot more out of the cost of your regen versus your cost reduction. The other thing too with cost reduction is it's only really useful if you're casting an ability. So if you're caught in mechanics and you can't cast abilities, that regen is not really doing you any good. That glyph is basically useless while you're not casting any abilities. Regen, on the other hand, does help out no matter what. It's always active. So let's say you die and you get rezzed. The cost reduction is not going to be quite as helpful there, because it's basically you're starting off with 20% resources versus the regen, which is going to be a lot more helpful to get your resources all the way back up to full. So conclusion, regen glyph completely trumps cost reduction. There's absolutely no reason for you to run cost reduction at all under any scenario whatsoever. That's it for this video. Hope you guys found this informative. Let me know down in the comment section below if you have any questions, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.